Okay, good morning everyone. Let's see who's here. Tika's here, good morning. Mashid is here. Hello Mashid again. Good morning KC again. Jenna, hi Jenna. Ying is here, good morning Ying. Cindy's here, hello. Min is here, good morning Min. Good morning Pearly. Good morning Carmen, and good morning Michael. All right, that's not bad. We got people trickling in. Who else is here? Liana's here, good morning to you. Who else? Who else is here? Ella's here. Hello, Ella. Okay, so as people continue to sort of pop in here, today what we'll do, we'll talk a little bit about the TED Talk we watched yesterday, The Power of Story. We'll talk a little bit more about Sumerian cultures. I have a little bit of the textbook for you to read. I have a tiny little homework assignment for you to do. And we may get to Egypt today, but I'm not entirely sure. We'll see about that. Adalbert, good morning to you, and Karen, good morning to you too. Yeah, that's kind of what we'll do today, I think. So let's. That is that Lim? I think. Good morning, Lim, if that's you. Sorry. Okay. Let's dive in. Let's dive in here. Sam's here. Good morning, Sam. Oh, it is Lim. Okay, good morning to you. Luan's here. Good morning to you. And okay, awesome. Let's go. So we've been talking about Mesopotamia for the last day or so, right? The land between two rivers. And again, it's not a culture. It's an area of the world, right? But it's hosted a number of different cultures throughout the ancient world. Good morning, Jimmy. The Sumerians first, then later the Akkadians will gain control of the area. The Babylonians will come later. The Persians will conquer that area a little bit later in history, and so the Greeks will conquer it. And so this area of the world will come under the control of a number of different cultures and a number of different groups. But we're kind of starting out, that's okay, Chris, good morning. We're starting out with the Sumerians, right? And the Sumerians, we said, are one of the first civilizations to appear. Sorry, I'll just go through that. So yesterday we were talking a little bit about Sumerian social structure, right? And I think we said that there were a number of different kind of general categories that people fit into, right? So Sumerian city-states had kings that were leaders of the city-state. They had a set of priests who maintained the temples and kind of interacted with the gods and helped people to pray and make offerings to the gods to make sure that they didn't get punished. We had kind of a middle class of people that were people who owned property, people who were scribes, so who were literate, who knew how to read and write, soldiers, merchants, people who sold things, craftsmen, so people who made all of the different things that the Sumerians would have needed for their lives. And then we had kind of a lower class, maybe farmers were in there too, and then a lower class of kind of simple peasants who didn't really own any land, and slaves, right? So we had kind of a stratified society, right? A society with levels. And again, that's pretty different from the hunter-gatherers and foragers we started out with, where pretty much everyone was on the same level. It was a very egalitarian social structure. But here we have lots of different levels, with people having different amounts of power, different amounts of status in society, and different amounts of resources, right? Different amounts of wealth. We also read a little bit yesterday about what is cuneiform, and we'll come back to that, and what we learned from Sumerian writings. We'll come back to that as well. So we said that Sumerian writing was important because it allowed us to learn things about the Sumerians that we couldn't tell from archaeology alone, right? And so archaeology can tell you, based on the things that people leave behind, based on the physical evidence of their behavior, we can tell what they were doing, but we can't really tell what they were thinking, right? We don't have any access to their values, their beliefs, their ideologies, their stories, right? We don't, good morning, Manish. We don't really have access to any of those things. And if you remember our little iceberg diagram, that's really most of what culture is, right? Most of what culture isn't, solid objects that preserve in the archaeological record. Most of what culture is imagined, right? It's belief, it's value, it's story. And so when people start to write things down 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, that's our first window into what people are actually thinking in the past and what people believe. And so the cuneiform writing, the writing that the Sumerians start to do, is very significant for that reason, right? We said one of the things that we learn about from their writing is their religious system, and we said that they had a polytheistic religion, so they had lots of different gods and goddesses, and people were required to honor and sacrifice to the gods, and if they didn't, the gods would punish them. And so again, the gods aren't there to love you. The gods aren't there to take care of you. The gods are there to be respected and honored and feared, right? And if you don't respect them and honor them properly, they will punish you, right? So these are kind of, the Mesopotamian gods are a little bit scary in some ways. And so we said that every city had its own god or goddess that protected it. They were thought to live in the ziggurat, that large sort of stepped pyramid that we saw in the middle of Sumerian city-states. And again, the priests were the ones who interacted with the gods. And so regular people didn't get to go into the ziggurat and pray. It was only for the god and for the priests that knew how to perform the proper rituals. And the other thing we said is that the Mesopotamian gods, quite interestingly, were kind of very non-perfect beings, right? And so they were all powerful, right? They were associated with the wind and the sky and lightning and things like that. They were very powerful beings, but they acted in a very human way, right? So sometimes they would be childish, sometimes they would be angry, sometimes they would be jealous, sometimes they would cheat on their wives or their husbands. And so the world of the Mesopotamian gods, actually like many other religions that followed, was very dramatic, right? And it was lots of kind of ups and downs, and it was a little more like a soap opera, if you will. And so, whoops, did I go backward or forward? Right. So the priests were the ones who were responsible for interacting with the gods. And again, it's interesting to consider that the Sumerians and Mesopotamians didn't really have a very clear picture of the afterlife. And so after you died, in their religion, you kind of go to this kind of dark, shadowy place, and nothing really happens. It's very quiet. And it's really awful. And so not a very encouraging place to go after you die, unfortunately. In contrast to many other religions, particularly the Egyptian religion, which we'll talk about shortly. So we said that they invented this writing system called cuneiform. We said that they would often write in clay because that's what they had available to them. There wasn't a lot of trees to make paper out of. And we have a significant amount of writing from the Sumerians, and some of it's personal, like business letters you see here. Some of it was kind of accounting, so there's ledgers and receipts and things like that, and legal documents. Some of their writing is religious in terms of prayers and hymns and things like that. So a typical tablet kind of looks like this. And we said that the other thing that was interesting is that it taught us something about the Sumerian language, right? And we said that this was potentially an important thing, because we said that the SAPIR-WHORF hypothesis is one way of considering how language works, how language influences people. And the hypothesis states that based on the language that you speak or the language that you learn, it actually influences how you see the world. And one of the things we said yesterday is that if you know more than one language, you've probably noticed that things don't translate perfectly from one language to another. So each language kind of divides up or conceptualizes the world just a little bit differently, right? And so SAPIR-WHORF hypothesis says that because of that, the way you perceive the world, the way you understand the world, is connected to the language that you speak. And so every language community kind of sees the world slightly differently, which is kind of an interesting idea. And so that led us to this book. This led us to Jonathan Gottschall's The Storytelling Animal. And so we talked about this yesterday, with regard to the idea that the cuneiform writing that the Sumerians had allowed us to learn about what kind of stories the Sumerians were telling themselves, right? And again, stories existed for thousands of years before the Sumerians, but of course we don't have any access to them. We don't know what stories people were telling each other 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 years ago. But finally, when people start writing things down, now we can start to understand them. And so just to start off with, I just had a kind of a for fun question for you. What's your favorite story? And when I say story, I mean any kind of story. So it could be a book, it could be a movie, it could be a television show, I guess it could be a poem, it could be a religious story like Jonathan Gottschall talked about yesterday in his TED Talk. What's your favorite? What kind of stories do you like? What kind of stories do you like? What kind of television, movies, songs can be thought of stories. If some of them are a little more story-like than others, but music can be story. Plays or stories. Okay, so Avatar and The Last Airbender. Okay, I haven't seen The Last Airbender, but Avatar's a really interesting story. Fairy tales. Fairy tales are. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Fairy tales are kind of mythological stories in some cases, and they're common to all cultures as well, Ella. Supernatural, the TV show, and scary stories, right? That's kind of interesting too. Humans love their scary stories. Cindy says romantic stories, yeah. Superhero stories, yes, very popular. Min says comedy, funny stories, yeah. Pika also comedy. Chris says Epic of Gilgamesh and mythical stories. Yeah, so we have lots of myth now that has been written down, and we can read them today, or we can make them into movies or whatever. Jenna says, yeah, romantic stories. Yeah, so this is another very interesting aspect of what it means to be a human, right? We've one of, I think, the points of this one of the points of this course is to look at other cultures and to not only understand them as distinct cultures, but also to see how cultures are alike, right? To see how human beings are similar. And our love of story, I think, is one of those things, right? This is one of the things that all cultures seem to love. And even if we go back 6,000 or 7,000 years to the very first written accounts in the Sumerian language, what do we see almost immediately? We see stories, right? We see stories that people tell themselves. Pearlie says, yeah, mystery stories. Yeah, those are good too. And so, if you remember the TED Talk yesterday, which I hope you do, Jonathan Gottschall starts out with a bit of a dirty joke. Sorry about that. And then he's making an argument to us, right? He's making a case that, anthropologists like to look for what is significant about humans. Why are we so unique? Why are we so different? And he says, yeah, we run around on 2 feet. We have the Latin name Homo sapiens, which means thinking man or wise man. And so we have this big brain that can do all these things. But Jonathan Gottschall is saying another critically important part of what it is to be human is to tell stories to each other. And it's something that we've been doing for probably all of our history. We have been creating stories. And Jonathan says that really all day long, that's what we are engaged with, right? We're talking to each other, and what do? We're telling ourselves stories, right? We're calling our friends or texting them, you'll never guess what happened to me today, blah, 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 right? We're telling them a little story about what happened to us, right? We tell us this story, oh, this one time we were at this place and then this happened. We tell each other stories, right? When we are all forced into lockdown because of a pandemic disease, what do? We turn on Netflix, right? We consume stories. Jonathan Gottschall says when we go to sleep, what happens? Well, our bodies are sleeping and our conscious minds are off, but our subconscious mind is awake, right? It's dreaming. It's telling itself stories all night long. And so Jonathan Gottschall says that this is something we do because hang on. Am I about to answer? Yeah, see, I'm about to answer one of my own questions. I don't want to do that. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask you a question. And so in Jonathan Gottschall's TED Talk, he makes a point that something happens to people's brains when they're engaged in story. So when they're reading a book, when they're watching a movie or watching a television show, they're paying attention to it, something's happening in their brain. What's happening? And this is interesting. What's happening? What's happening in the brains of people who are engaged in story? People are either watching a film, watching TV, watching a play, reading a book, whatever it happens to be. What's going on? What's going on up there? Ayana says, okay, so they zone out of the real world. Yeah, so that's one thing, right? We do use story to escape from our own lives sometimes, right? That is very true. Yeah, so Casey says, whenever we feel a certain feeling or tension, our brain also reacts or looks the same way. Yeah, the brain is reading stories. Yeah, and so Cindy says, if you see someone angry on screen, your brain looks angry too. Your brain experiences the same emotions. Yeah, that's weird, right? So Jonathan Gottschall says if you're watching a movie and someone is angry or sad, your brain doesn't look like someone who is watching someone be angry or sad. Your brain actually looks angry or sad, right? Brains instruct our bodies to do the things that we would actually do in that scenario. Yeah, you feel yourself in the story, right? You project yourself into it. And so if the character on screen is really sad, sometimes we cry a little bit, right? We are sad too. If we're watching a really scary movie, for those of you who like that, I don't like that because I'm too chicken for those, but for those of you who like scary movies, you might kind of curl up in a ball, right? You might protect yourself as if you're physically under attack, right? Which of course you're not, but your brain kind of thinks you are. And so you're having the same feeling. And so that's really that's really interesting, right? Because again, you're not, when we engage with stories, we're not spectators, we're not watching the story, we're actually participating in it, right? We're a part of it. And so Pearlie says here, the neuroscience, yeah, we're seeing it as if it's real, right? So there's a part of our brain, and this is probably the sort of, probably the outside, the cortical part of your brain, the more logical part of your brain. That part of your brain knows that you are in a movie theater. Okay, so if you're watching a scary movie, there is this sort of outer cortical, more advanced part of your brain. It knows you're in a movie. But the subcortical areas, the older parts of your brain, the less evolved parts of your brain, it doesn't know the difference, right? And so that's the part of the brain that is getting stimulated, right? That's the part of the brain that is feeling afraid. And so we kind of have both things going on at the same time. We know we're in a theater, we know that we're safe, but there is a part of our brain that doesn't know, and that part of our brain reacts the way it would as if we were really afraid or really sad, or if something was really happening to us. Which again, I think is super, super, super interesting. And so I guess the question is, and maybe specifically with, if we think about stories that are sad, or stories that are really, really scary, I guess the question is that why do you think people tell themselves stories? So why would somebody want to go to a terrifying movie and then be terrified? Wouldn't you think that people wouldn't want to do that? Wouldn't you think that people wouldn't want to scare themselves like that? Why did they go? Why do people go to sad movies that they come out of and they're crying and they're upset? Why do people do that to themselves, I wonder? What do you think? Mashid says, one of the reasons could be escapism from the hard lives they have. I think I agree with you, Mashid, and I think there are certain types of movies that allow us to do that, right? There's lots of movies or TV shows that are feel-good movies, right? So you go into them, you know they're going to be funny, you know you're going to enjoy them, and you know you're going to come out feeling good, right? So that is, yeah, I definitely agree with you there. But the sad movies and the scary movies are different, right? So Karen says, feel better or experience different emotions. Yeah, so we might watch a movie to elevate our mood, right? If we're feeling so-so, we might put on that movie or TV show that we really like because we know it'll make us feel better. Might have to do with helping us experience different emotions, right? Cindy says, oh, that's a good one, actually. Cindy says, communicate, connect, learn, and think with each other. Yeah, so the stories that we engage with, almost always, we engage with them as a group, right? And so almost more fun than watching a movie or watching a TV series or reading a book. Almost more fun is actually talking about it with other people, right? So not only do we look at the screen and we engage in the emotions and the struggles of these characters, but then what do? We go and we talk about it with other people, right? We talk about it with friends. And so the story not only affects the feeling part of our brain, but it also serves as something to connect us together, right? It's something that we can share with each other, something that we can interact with each other. Yeah, that's good. Eliana says, for entertainment, absolutely, right? Stories have to be entertaining. If they're not entertaining, people generally don't watch or read them, right? So they have to entertain you. To escape if you're having a hard time, and it's also because we live dream stories all the time, which can help us communicate with each other. Yeah. So again, they can help us feel, they can help us change our emotional state if we want to, and they can help us to communicate with each other. Psychological hint: looking for stimulation or comforting. Yeah, it's we can use these stories to regulate our mood. Yeah. Pearly, yeah, to connect, definitely. Aliana, to pass time, definitely. Yeah, if looking for sympathy and sharing, right? So, again, I think part of the reason that we watch shows, or whether we engage in certain stories, is because other people do, and then we can talk about it. I remember, I'm not sure, probably, I don't know if anyone's seen Game of Thrones. You can give me a thumbs up if you have. Most people probably have, but for the first few years Game of Thrones was on, I didn't watch it, and so I sort of knew about it, but I wasn't super interested in watching it at the time. And when I told people, when they said, "Oh, did you see Game of Thrones last night?" and I said, "No, I'm not watching it," people would look at me like, and I would feel really left out, right? You would feel that, there was this way that you could have connected with people that now you can't. You feel like you're on the outside of the group. And so I think part of the fun of engaging in stories is not just engaging with the story itself, but then being part of a larger group of people who know the story and can talk about it with you, right? So eventually I did watch Game of Thrones, so that now I'm part of the group and I can talk to people about it. Pearly says, yeah, to understand how to deal with problems and which emotions we have. Yeah. So it can be, engaging with story can be a way in which we can experience emotions, but in a safe way, right? So we might want to experience fear or experience sadness, but that doesn't mean we want somebody to be chasing us with a knife in real life, right? We don't actually want our lives to be in danger, right? Or we might want to experience that sadness, we might want to feel it, but we don't want something awful to happen to us, right? So engaging with stories can help us to experience emotions and to know how those emotions feel, but without having to go through it in real life, right? And lots of stories, I think, are like that. They are enjoyable to take part in, and they're enjoyable, but you wouldn't want those things to happen to you, right? And so those of you who like scary movies, you probably enjoy them because that's why you watch them, but I'm sure that you wouldn't want, a serial killer chasing you, or you wouldn't want your house to be haunted or anything like that. But it's fun to experience, right? So Albert says it brings a sense of understanding with each other. Yeah, it's a common understanding, right? We share a common idea about things when we share stories. Or if someone forces you to watch it, yeah, that's definitely true. So Aliana is not a fan. Casey has seen Game of Thrones. Yeah, and so yeah, that's all good. That's all really good. And so at the beginning, I asked you what your favorite stories are, and you told me comedies or scary movies or romantic things or superhero things. We had all kinds of stories, but based on kind of what you know about yourself and the stories you like, and based on what Jonathan Gottschall was telling us, why do you think you like those stories? Why do you think you like the stories that you do? I guess in a way what I'm asking you is, what do you think your choice of story tells you about yourself? guess that's what I'm kind of asking. But what do you think? Why do you think you like the stories that you like? Hopefully it's not too personal. I don't think it is, but oh yeah, okay. Yeah, because you might wish it was your life, or could it be applied to real life? So I guess it's kind of fantasy realization, right? If you're interested in a romantic movie, you might wish that you could sort of fall in love like the characters on the screen, right? And so you can enjoy that story and sort of pretend for a minute that it's you, right? Yeah, so Cindy might say it might reflect some parts of your life, right? You might see things on screen that are similar to the way that you, similar to certain parts of your life, and it can, I guess, influence how you think about those things, right? Or how you react to them. Yeah, sometimes those things are relatable, right? The things that happen to characters in stories are things that can happen to us in real life. Yeah. Yeah, maybe just because it's interesting, because you're interested in that thing, right? Yeah, that's another thing, right? Actors are good looking often, and so we might want to watch a movie because the actors are super hot. That is true. It boosts our feelings of things like trust. Yeah, it can. Yeah, you can feel better about certain things or certain situations, right? It makes you dream about it. Okay, so it can inspire you to, yeah, it can inspire you to think things or do things a little bit differently. Yeah, it shows different perspectives, right? So I guess that's the opposite side. Sometimes the things that we see in stories or that we read in stories are relatable, right? They reflect our experience, but sometimes we might engage in a story that shows us a totally different experience, right? One that we might not have, a perspective that we might not have access to. Yeah, I think that's good. Aliana says loves horror because it challenges her not to be scared. Yeah, so it's fun, right? Being a little bit scared is kind of exciting, but also it helps you to work through those emotions, right? It helps you to feel afraid and learn to manage your fear, but you're managing it in an environment that you know is actually safe, right? You don't have to learn to manage your fear in a really dangerous situation, right? Yeah, those things are all good. So this idea of story is pretty interesting, right? Especially when we apply story to all kinds of things, right? When we, not only movies or television, but music, poems, religious stories, things that we talk about with our friends, things that have happened to us, the story of our country, right? All of our countries have kind of origin stories of how they came to be. We have jokes, we have, like, all these things are versions of story. And so I think what Jonathan Gottschall is saying here, I think he's making a good point, that one of the major ways that human beings understand the world is through stories, right? So Jonathan Gottschall is saying that our world, our environment there's all kinds of things happening, and there's people coming and going and saying things and doing things, and story helps us to organize all of those things. It helps us to put them in some kind of order, in some kind of structure, so that we can understand what our experience is all about, right? And so we create narratives, we create stories, okay? And I think that's very true. I think he is very right, that the creation of stories is an important part of how of how human beings live their lives and how they learn to understand it. Okay, so I asked you these questions. You answered them all very well. It was very interesting what you said. Now, I think, I forget if it was Sam, somebody mentioned the Epic of, or Chris, sorry, it was Chris who mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh earlier. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the earliest stories that we have access to. It dates back at least to 2100 BC, so that's about 4,000 years ago. But that's only the first evidence we have of the story being written down. It's very likely that the story existed before that, but people were just passing it down orally. So they were just telling it to each other sort of generation after generation. So it's a very old story. At the very least, it's about 4,000 years old. And the Gilgamesh story falls into the category of a type of story that we would call myths, okay? So in the story, Chris will know this, but for those of you who might not, Gilgamesh is the hero of the story, and he is semi-mythic. And what that means is that he's probably not real the way he is in the story, but there is an actual king of Uruk in the king's list named Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh was a real king, but all of the stuff that happens to him in the story is probably made up. So he's based on a true story, if you will. So again, he's semi-mythic, and he's a demigod. And that's interesting too, because demigods show up in all kinds of different stories. And demigods are half gods. And so usually they have one parent who's a god and one parent who is a regular mortal, a regular person. There's lots of examples of this. Hercules or Heracles is one of these. Achilles is one of these. Maui, if you've seen Moana, Maui is a demigod, right? He has a god parent and a human parent. And so Gilgamesh is one of these too, one of these sort of half god, half mortal people. Now, myths are specific types of stories for, I think, 3 reasons. Now, one of which is that myths are stories that are passed down from generation to generation. And so we often see this with myths, is that they're something that are told for long, long periods of time. The second part of myths is that they usually contain some aspect of the fantastic. And so what I mean by fantastic is not awesome. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying mythical stories usually have an element that is outside of reality, okay? And so sometimes you'll have, if you think of Game of Thrones has a little bit of magic. Game of Thrones has dragons, right? Those are elements of the fantastic. If you look at all the Marvel movies, for instance, which I think are excellent examples of modern myths. If you look at all the Marvel movies, you'll see, people have superpowers, right? They can fly and turn into big green things and swing from webs, through the city. Those are all fantastic, right? They are outside of the normal. And so myths have those. They're stories that are passed down generation to generation, and they usually have some sort of supernatural or fantastic quality to them. They're not just regular human stories where regular human things happen. And the third part is that they usually contain some sort of lesson or moral. And so myths are entertaining. They're usually fun stories, but there's usually something that cultures are trying to teach in their myths as well. There's some kind of lesson to be learned, and that's kind of what myths are and how they function. They're entertaining stories. They're passed down usually for long periods of time. They're fantastic in some way, but there's also something that a culture is trying to understand or trying to teach itself by telling itself this story. Okay. So that said, here's our friend Gilgamesh, or at least a carving, a stone carving of him. You can see he's got a lion here. I think there's a story. One of the stories, I think he wrestles a lion, if I remember correctly. So this is Gilgamesh, and again, it's one of the earliest stories that we have record of, and so it's written on stone tablets like this, and so we're still able to read them. And so the question I want to ask here at this point is, what does the story of Gilgamesh tell us about Sumerian culture? And so I just asked you, what kind of stories do you like, and why do you think you like them? And you thought about some reasons why you might like them. And so now what I'd like to challenge you to do, and this will be more difficult, but what I'd like to challenge you to do is to look at the story of Gilgamesh and see what we might be able to learn about the Sumerians based on this story. They clearly like this story because, well, they invented it, and then they passed it down for generation to generation. They wrote it down. Later cultures that came after the Sumerians, they told the story too. So there's Akkadian versions and Babylonian versions of the Gilgamesh story. And so the story gets told for a long period of time. So people obviously liked it. People obviously connected with it in some way. And so I'm curious, if we know the story of Gilgamesh, can we learn anything, or can we imagine something about the Sumerian culture and kind of why they like this story to begin with? So here's what I'd like you to do. I would like you to watch this short video. So the video is an explanation of the story of Gilgamesh and how it goes in general. It's a confusing story. It's kind of a weird story, or set of stories, I guess is what it is. It's kind of strange, but based on the story itself, what can you tell about the Sumerians and Sumerian culture, about the things that they believe, the things that they think are important, what a hero is supposed to be? What do you think you can tell about the Sumerians based on the story? Okay, that's what I'd like you to do. And so what I'll do here is, give me 1 second. I'll do something behind the scenes here. So what you see on the screen, I'm just going to dump it into, I'm going to dump it into Microsoft Teams. So you'll have the video link and you'll have the questions. And what I would like you to do is, I'd like you to watch the video, which I think is about 10 minutes long. I'd like you to answer the questions. Don't forget to type them out, because I want you to put them into the live chat. Then I want you to take a break, and then I want you to come back here, okay? So maybe what I'll do is we'll take about 10 minutes to watch the video and a few minutes to get our answers typed. We'll take a break. We'll take a 10-minute break in the middle like we normally do. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll see you back here at 11:20. Okay, so at 11:20 we'll be back here. We'll have watched the video about Gilgamesh. We'll have some answers, and then we can talk about it. Okay, so Ella thinks that's cool. So awesome. I think it's cool too. Okay, so go watch the video, answer the questions, type them out, take a little break, and then we'll come back here and we'll talk about what we might be able to determine from this Epic of Gilgamesh story. Okay, so I'll see you in just a little Okay, and we're back. So we're talking about this Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Basically, one of the first stories that we have access to in the archaeological record. Certainly there were stories before, but of course we don't have any access to them because they don't preserve. And Sumerians start writing things down, and so starting around 4,000 years ago, we have this story written down called the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? And it's kind of a hero's story, if you will. We'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. But first, let's kind of dive into this. So the crash course video gave us a little bit of an outline of what the story is like. I used to actually have, in this class, I used to have people actually read the Epic of Gilgamesh, the actual story. Depending on the translation you have, it's kind of a difficult read. There's obviously it's translated from another language. Obviously it's very ancient, and so it's a tough story to read in its original form. But I think Crash Course here does a really good job of describing how the story goes, even though I think we could probably all agree it's a little bit weird. So let me hear your thoughts here. One of the questions I asked was, what can we determine about the beliefs or values or ideologies of the Sumerians based on this Gilgamesh story, right? This Gilgamesh story is one that seems a little probably weird to us in a few ways, but to the Sumerians it didn't feel weird. To them it was a very kind of natural story. And so what might we be able to tell about them from this story? What did you say? Karen said, yeah, that's a really interesting one, right, Karen? The idea here is that even though, Gilgamesh tries really hard, and even though he's a demigod, he is greater than human, he can fail, right? And he does fail repeatedly in his quest for immortality. He falls asleep, he does wrong things, he starts out this story as, a total jerk. So he actually fails quite a lot for a hero, which is kind of interesting, even though he tries his best to accomplish his goals. Chris says, yeah, that people have flaws and limitations, and realizing those will bring happiness to the individual. Yeah, so that's almost a bit of a lesson that's part of this myth, right? We said that myths are passed down from generation to generation. They're fantastic in some way, and they carry a lesson or a moral or something we're supposed to learn. And Gilgamesh fits all of these three. It was passed down. It's very fantastic. There's monsters and things like that, and going into the underworld. And maybe there's a lesson here too. And so part of Gilgamesh's success is understanding his own limitations, right? And understanding himself. What else? Ellis says, something is meant to be like that. Yeah, there's a certain amount of, I guess this is connected to Chris's comment, but some things are not changeable, right? Some things are futile, right? When we get to the Greeks, I think we'll talk about this. The Greeks like to explore this in their tragic plays. They like to explore situations where no matter how hard the main character of the play tries, he cannot succeed, right? There is something that will forever keep him from achieving what he wants to achieve. And it's tragic, right? It's awful that what the character most wants cannot be obtained, right? And so I think that's kind of what that reminds me of there, Ella, is that some things are meant to be in this way. Some things cannot be changed. And so that's what I think Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh when he's in the underworld. He says, man is destined to die, They'll be cut down like reeds, people die, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? And so, of course, later on he finds the cure to immortality and then foolishly loses it, but that's another story. What else? What else can we tell about the Sumerians from this story? Even just basic things that you might think are not, particularly insightful, but this is how historians and archaeologists and classicists work. They look at sources like this, they look at text, and they try to figure out what the Sumerians were like. And so there might be even some very basic observations that you can make that wouldn't be wrong or wouldn't be out of place. That's what historians have to do. Some things are very insightful and some things are more obvious, but they still need to be said. Okay, so you might say the goddesses are not as important as the gods. Okay, so you might be able to tell from that story. Well, you might be able to tell from that story that there are multiple gods, right? That we have a polytheistic system, and we can have some idea about importance, right? About which gods might be more important, or which goddesses might be more important. Yeah, you can definitely tell that, Karen. That's for sure. What else? What else can we tell? I'll give you a minute and I'll keep my fingers crossed that you have something for me. Isn't goddess? Yes, goddess is a female god. Goddess is a female god. Okay, well, how about I ask you this then? According to this story, according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, what's a hero? What does it mean? What does it mean to be a hero, according to the story of Gilgamesh? Because hero stories are very popular, have been popular all the way through human history, basically from story number 1 here with Gilgamesh, all the way to all the way to the modern day. We have lots of stories that are based around heroes. And so Cindy says, yeah, he's a hero not just because he's super strong or he does all these things that are beyond human capacity, but because he comes to understand who he is, right? Who he is as a person, and he comes to understand how the world works. And so he doesn't simply do great things, but he comes to an understanding. He gains some knowledge or insight. Casey says he grows past his mistakes and accepts his limitations, right? So he starts out as a total jerk of a king, right? Everybody kind of hates him in the story, and they don't mention this in the video, but by the end, spoiler alert, when Gilgamesh dies, the people are sad. The people are crying at his funeral, even though at the beginning of the story they all hate him. And so yeah, he becomes more than he was before. He grows, right? He becomes a better person, and he comes to accept the things he can do, but he also accepts the things that he is not able to do, right? And again, there's lots of those things that he's not able to do. He fails quite a bit, which I think somebody pointed out earlier. a creation that results from past mistakes and accepting limitations. Yeah, so heroes are heroes have limits, right? And heroes make mistakes. Someone who triumphs from a task or accepts their defeats as long as they tried. Yeah, so he, at the end of the story, he comes to understand his successes and his failures, right? He's able to take both of those things, and I think as Cindy mentioned, he's able to take his successes and failures and come to understand himself and sort of the nature of reality, right? That was Mashi. Karen says someone, okay, we got that one. Yeah, but he tries, right? The effort is there. He overcomes mortality for himself and others. Yeah, he briefly does, right? He finds that he gets a hold of that plant, which will give him immortality, but then very strangely he decides to take a bath, right? And then a snake comes up and eats the plant, and then he's lost his immortality. They don't mention it in the video either, but that's a bit of an origin story for snakes, because that's how the Sumerians explain why snakes shed their skin, because they ate this plant of immortality. And so if you think about it, the snake kind of grows old and its skin gets wrinkly, and then what does it do? It sheds it, and it has a fresh, new, young skin underneath. And so in the story, the snake kind of becomes immortal because it eats this plant instead of Gilgamesh. And so they explain why snakes shed their skin as part of the story. Yeah, he does defeat the Humbaba, right? He does defeat this sort of mythical monster. And he's determined, he's persistent, right? And I think that's something that we could probably say is common to almost all heroes throughout history. Heroes don't give up, right? Heroes are persistent. Yeah, he's a person who is admired, right? If not at the beginning of the story, certainly at the end, the people look up to Gilgamesh, they see him as a hero, and again, they cry at his funeral, right? They're sad when he dies. Yeah, that's all good stuff. That is all good stuff. I wanted to mention something really quickly because they mention it in the video, and that's the idea of the hero's journey, or monomyth. I didn't want to dig too deeply into this because it's kind of complicated. And for us to really understand it, it would probably take a bit of work, and we probably don't have time for it. But this monomyth thing, it was the idea of Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was kind of a historian, very interested in human myth. And what he was trying to do was he was studying, he was an academic, studying all these myths from around the world. And what he thought he noticed was that there were a lot of hero stories. So a lot of stories where a hero goes out on a great quest and has a bunch of adventures and returns home eventually. Lots of cultures had a story like this. And Joseph Campbell thought that he thought he saw a pattern. He thought that, gee, these kind of myths are following the same kind of pattern in all different cultures in all different time periods. And so his idea of the hero's journey, he kind of laid it out like this, where heroes kind of start out in the ordinary world. So they're living their regular lives, you know, same old, day in, day out. And then something happens and they are called to adventure. And so what happens through this series of events is that they go out on an adventure, they make friends, they are tested. They are tested, they battle monsters or various things. They are rewarded, and then they return back to their original place, having succeeded, but also having been changed, okay? And so he thought he saw this pattern in a large number of myths around the world. And so he was thinking, maybe there's something very important about the way that humans see their existence, because Joseph Campbell was arguing that everybody seems to be telling the same story, and the details are different, the characters are different, the challenges are different, but the story kind of unfolds in a very similar way. And so his question was, what if we're all telling the same story? Cultures going all the way back to the Sumerians, all the way to the modern day. What if we're all telling the same story? And it's interesting because if you look at this pattern, it might not seem obvious to you, but there are lots of stories that follow this particular pattern. And so Gilgamesh follows this pattern, the hero's journey pattern. The stories of King Arthur, if you know about King Arthur, the British hero, he follows this story. There are Greek myths that follow this story. If you've seen Star Wars follows this story. And Star Wars follows this story because the creator of Star Wars, George Lucas, actually read Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, and he actually built the story of Star Wars, the original 3 movies from the 70s and 80s. He actually built that story based on the hero's journey. And so if you watch those Star Wars movies, you'll see that Luke Skywalker goes through all of these stages. And again, that's not an accident. George Lucas wrote it that way. Harry Potter follows this structure. Harry Potter goes on his own hero's journey. The original Spider-Man movie, so from 2000 or whenever it was, follows this pattern. What else follows this pattern? Lord of the Rings follows this pattern. Frodo starts out in the ordinary world, and then he is given the ring by Bilbo, and then he is called to adventure, right? He is called into this adventure to get rid of the ring. So there's huge numbers of stories. Chris says here, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think, because it's a tragic story. That one I might be wrong about, Chris. I thought I remembered that the Arthurian legends followed the pattern of the hero's journey. It's possible I'm incorrect about that. So maybe don't quote me on that. The other one I'm remembering actually now is the he dies by his son. Well, actually, that's the other thing too. We might be able to mention is that just because a hero goes on the journey and sort of returns home doesn't necessarily mean that he's happy or triumphant. Okay, so the hero goes on this journey and they go into this. They have these adventures. They gain something, and they come home. They come back home forever changed by their adventures. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's a happy ending. And you could probably reference Lord of the Rings for that too, because if you've seen Lord of the Rings, Frodo succeeds, right? Frodo gets rid of the ring and saves Middle-earth. But Frodo's life isn't really happy after that, right? He's been changed by the ring in a negative way, and he's really lost a piece of himself as a result. But you might be right about that, Chris. I'm not sure about the Arthur thing. I might be misremembering, which sometimes happens. But regardless, there's lots of stories that follow this hero's journey, which is kind of an interesting thing. So here's kind of what I was thinking for Epic of Gilgamesh. What can we learn? Well, one of the things is persistence, right? Gilgamesh is persistent, and I think Pearlie and a few other people pointed that out. He is brave, right? There is a value to courage. He goes off and does brave things. He confronts this huge, terrifying monster in a forest. He sets off into the darkness, into the underworld to find immortality. Yeah, those are courageous things to do, right? And a few people mentioned this one as well. I'm using a fancy word here, redemption, but I think that's kind of what KC is talking about here, growing past mistakes and accepting limitations. So Gilgamesh becomes more than who he was. He started off as a bad king and a jerk and someone who people hated. And through his adventures, he's redeemed. He actually becomes a hero. He becomes someone who, when he dies, people are actually sad, right? What else did we say here? Yeah, beliefs. We can tell something about the beliefs of the Sumerians because there are multiple gods in this story. So we know that they have a religious system that's polytheistic, right? It has multiple gods. We also might be able to learn, and we already kind of knew this, but we can see it in the story, is that the gods must receive respect or you will be punished, right? And we saw that with Enkidu, right? The Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they kill the bull of heaven, and Enkidu slaps the goddess Ishtar in the face, right? And so that's obviously very rude. You're not supposed to do that to anyone, never mind a goddess. And she kills Enkidu in punishment, right? So honor the gods or you will be punished. And then what does it mean to be a hero? And I think we said some of these things, right? We said that Gilgamesh is a hero not because he succeeds all the time. It's because sometimes he fails, right? And he fails in a number of places in this story. So heroes don't always succeed. Heroes sometimes fail. He gains a reward from his trials, but it's not really the reward that he thought, right? Especially for the second part where he goes off looking for immortality. He goes off looking for eternal life, and what he finds at the end is not eternal life but better understanding. And so the reward that he gets from that story is not the reward that he thinks he's getting, right? So there's sometimes the end of your quest is not what you think it's going to be, right? In the end, I think you can disagree with me here, but Gilgamesh succeeds due to his humanity, not his divinity. And so I think a couple of people said that too, is that, you know, he's not a hero because of these great deeds that he can do. It's not his superhuman strength that make him a hero. It's his humanity, right? The fact that he realizes that he's human and realizes that he's mortal, right? That's his, that's kind of why he succeeds. And finally, and I wanted to sort of pitch this to you here, maybe this sort of hero's journey, maybe it's a metaphor for people's lives, right? Maybe we're all on this, maybe we're all on our own hero's journey. Maybe we're all the hero of our own story. All of us, you know, sort of appear into this world, and we're called to adventure, right? We're born into this world kind of without our knowledge or consent. We just appear, and then we have to kind of make it through, right? And so we meet, if you look at number 4, we meet mentors, right? We have our parents that are there to guide us. Eventually we leave our homes, right? We leave the ordinary world and we go out into the special world, right? We go out into the greater world outside of our house and outside of our family. There are tests, right? There are things that we have to do. We meet allies, we make friends. Sometimes we make enemies. We are challenged throughout our lives in various ways. And hopefully we are rewarded in some way as well. And then eventually we kind of return home, maybe we go into retirement kind of thing, and maybe we've come back from this sort of life journey, and maybe at the end we have some sort of reward for it. And I don't really know what that reward is, because I'm not at the end of my hero's journey. At least, fingers crossed, I'm not. But maybe that's the thing maybe that's why this pattern of the hero's journey works, right? Because maybe it is a metaphor for the life of all people. And so Gilgamesh goes on a hero's journey, Frodo goes on a hero's journey, Luke Skywalker goes on a hero's journey, but really we're all making that journey. It's just that it takes us our entire lives to make it. And so maybe that's why there's a lot of commonality between these hero's journey stories, because that is something that unites all of us, right? We all have a life to live, and we all kind of circle from our birth to our death, right? We all have this sort of complete journey to go on, even though the circumstances of all those journeys are different, right? We all live in different places, we all do different things, we all encounter different challenges, and maybe we all wind up with a different reward at the end, maybe. Okay, so I think, we've only got about 9 minutes left, so I think I might leave it there. But I don't know what you think, but I think that's super interesting to think about, the way that stories are really important to human beings, right? They serve as a way to organize our world, right? We can take events and people and kind of organize them into a narrative structure so that we can understand the lives that we live. We use stories to connect with others. We use stories to feel and explore emotions that we might want to feel, or that we want to feel in sort of a safe environment. And a lot of stories seem to have similar beats. They seem to have similar phases that they go through, particularly this hero's journey. And again, maybe the hero's journey can be seen as kind of a metaphor for life, right? And if that's true, if that's what's actually happening here, that makes sense, because again, stories are the way that humans understand their lives. And so why wouldn't we have a story structure that we can impose on our lives to help us understand how it works, right? And again, though, that hero's journey template shows up again and again and again. It shows up in all those movies and books that I mentioned. And I think, don't quote me on this either, but I think if you looked at some of the Marvel movies with the larger characters, like if you looked at Tony Stark, if you looked at Captain America, if you looked at their journey as well, I think you might see a similar pattern. I think you might see both of their journeys throughout all those movies following this hero's journey pattern. And so Tony Stark or Iron Man goes through that process, and so does Steve Rogers. Okay, are we good? Do you have any questions or comments or statements or anything that you want to say, or are we good? What do you think? What do you think there, people? Okay, so Cindy's good. Karen, I'm gonna interpret that as that you don't really have any questions, not that you're not really good. I'm hoping. um, Tika's good. Ella's okay. Casey's good. Adalbert's good. Carmen's good. Nasheed and Ying are both good. Okay. So sounds like everyone's okay. As always, if you have questions or whatever, you can message me. I'm around. But Liana's good. Okay. Good. Jenna's good. Okay. Sam's good. I will leave it there. So thank you very much for being here today. Thanks for interacting so much in the live stream. That was really good. Tomorrow we will wrap up the Mesopotamian Sumerian thing, and I think we'll move on to the Egyptians, okay? So Min's good too. All right, so I'll sign off there. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon, and I'll see you tomorrow, okay? So bye. You're welcome. You're welcome, Cindy. Bye.